Hello, Janice McWilliams here. And you may remember I'm a therapist and a spiritual director. Um, but I want you to know that I work with couples and I'm very passionate about helping couples learn to recognize fight patterns so that they may learn the traps that they're getting into as couples so that they can get out of them. This little talk is meant to help you learn to recognize fight patterns and be able to more successfully get out of them, to know what to do when you see them, so that you might be able to come out of this COVID-19 crisis without a big wound on your relationship. Right now, our stress hormones are way up. Our happy hormones are way down because we don't have as many outlets to get them. And the main evidence of that is irritability. And in marriage, when people are, not just marriage, in life, when we are irritable, we tend to get into more conflicts and to messier conflicts with our beloveds. And so I'm really concerned that people during this COVID-19 crisis, when we're so much together and have so few outlets, that we're going to find ourselves getting more and more irritable and and potentially into more and more conflicts that harm our foundation of goodwill and our relationship, and leave us at the end of this thing in potentially a worse place or a harmed place or even a crisis. So I hope if you can take note of some of these things, that you might be really helped and might be able to come out of this place even stronger if you learn some of these things. Okay, so let's start with looking at a few very predictable, typical kind of fight patterns that couples tend to get into. One is what I call the law and order fight dynamic. This is when we turn our relationship into a courtroom and we lawyer up and we start presenting evidence against our partner. It might sound something like this. So let's say, one of you asks the other for help. The reply then could be something like, "You do realize that every time I've asked you for help this week that you've said no. I'm sure of it because I've been keeping track." And then the delineation begins. "Yesterday, I asked you to unload the dishwasher, and you ignored me, and you went and helped the kids with their fort in the basement. The other day, I asked you to wipe down the delivery order that came, and you said that you didn't know how, and you gave it to me. When I asked you if you would tuck in the kids while I put away the dishes, you said no because they wanted me." Anyway, you start going. You're presenting the evidence. You figure, if I can just make it airtight, then there is no way my partner can argue with me. And it goes and it goes and it goes. It's not unusual that both partners start presenting evidence against each other. And it really is as if both of you think, if I can just make my case, that the other person's just going to go, "You know what? You're right. I see the light now. Thank you for making the case with me. I repent." And then all is well. But that is really not ever the way it goes. Typically, people respond poorly when they're, put on the stand basically and put in a courtroom dynamic. And so what this tends to foster is that even when we win the argument, even if we present the best case and make the evidence, make it airtight so that we win, we're really losing because the relationship is harmed in the end. You're not connected, you're less connected, and there's a greater tentativeness in the relationship, and the foundation of goodwill is harmed. And so even when you win, you lose. So I don't recommend a courtroom dynamic as a way to resolve conflict or to ask for help from one another. Another thing we can get into very easily is just fighting about the wrong things. And what I call this is when we accidentally get into a secondary or a tertiary fight about something. So let's just say the original fight is about who should fold the laundry. Okay, so who should fold the laundry? And things get a little heated, and somebody's like, "Oh my gosh, are you kidding me?" Well, then the partner in response to that says, "Stop yelling." And what does the other person say? "I was not yelling." "Yes, you were yelling." Okay, now you're in a secondary fight. The original conversation was about who should fold laundry. And now it's flipped into whether what spouse number two did constitutes yelling. It's an entirely subjective argument, and you really, you have to have some kind of third party to judge it or something. It really, it's an unwinnable thing. It doesn't really go anywhere. So whether the person was yelling is a secondary fight. Now we tick up into tertiary ones and on and on and on as well. Like the tertiary fight would be like, well, it wouldn't matter if I yelled if you weren't so sensitive. I'm not sensitive. Okay, now you're having a fight about whether the other person is sensitive. So it goes and goes and goes. As soon as you become aware of this, I urge you to just name it. Oh my gosh, we're having a secondary or tertiary fight. Let's get back to the original conversation if we can do so calmly. Anyway, so fighting about the wrong things, secondary and tertiary fights. Another dynamic that we get into is blaming and deflecting blame. So when it comes to the old unloading the dishwasher thing, you're like, well, how could I have unloaded the dishwasher if the kitchen was dirty from before? And you're the one that did that. Okay, so you get asked something and then you feel defensive, and so you just push it right back and push it towards that blame for the other person. This can be another dynamic that is so easy to fall into, because when we're able to blame, we can be in the place of being a victim. And actually being a victim is a really kind of more comfortable place to be in relationship than in being just kind of owning and responsible. So it's really tempting, but it's super harmful for relationship. Blame is almost always paired with defensiveness. And defensiveness, the Gottmans again, have pegged as one of the biggest predictors of the decline and downfall of relationships. So defensiveness and blame kind of partner together and tend to be something that really make fight patterns get very, very stuck. We tend to think, I'm entitled to defend if what my partner brings up is inaccurate. I just want to correct them, or I need to correct them. I should correct them. So that kind of interacting kind of brings us back to the first one, because it ends up turning us into a courtroom instead of a relationship, and we're lawyering up instead of really trying to hear each other and see where the other's coming from with a heart and mind to serve. Okay, staying engaged in a fight far too long. Now, this has to do a little bit with brain science. If this fist represents your brain, then your arm is the brain stem. Inside here, your thumb represents the limbic system, which is the amygdala and the fear and emotion center of the brain. This is where we get reactive. This is where we get defensive. This is our fight, flight, or freeze response. It's all in here. Now, the cortex and the prefrontal cortex wraps around the limbic system. It's right here, and it involves our capacity for language and reason. And we have to have the prefrontal cortex online in order to have relationship, because relationships are mediated through our verbal centers. So if this is you and this is your spouse and you're getting in conflict, if your blood pressure goes up to a certain point, and if you get elevated enough in this fight, then what's going to happen is this. Bing! Your prefrontal cortex is going to fly offline, and you're going to be driven by the limbic system, the fight, flight, or freeze response. So your capacity to reason and to have relationship is gone, and you are now driven by the threat centers of the brain. And when you are in this state, either like this, when both of you have your lids flipped, or if one of you does, there is absolutely no helpful point in you moving on. There's nothing good that's going to come from a limbic-driven and amygdala-driven interaction. The threat centers are just too strong at that point. You do well to take enough time to let your brain come back online and then re-enter the conversation later. But far too often, people stay engaged in this state and really hurt each other. They start calling names. They lawyer up. They blame. They defend. They do all the unhelpful things when the limbic system is kind of running the show. And so what we want to do is decrease the amount of times that we do that. let our brains come back online and create a habit and a pattern of coming back to conversations after we've been able to cool off. Okay, finally, is failing to repair well. And this is something that I talk about in the other video that is paired with this one, or you may be getting soon, I'm not sure. But in repairing well, basically we learn when we fight, and it's inevitable that we're going to fight some, that we learn how to repair well. And failing to do so is one of the hallmarks of relationships that that kind of wear down and become weaker and weaker. So repairing becomes, I would say, even more important than avoiding fighting. So repairing, essential, very, very important. Okay, so what does it take to be able to do something different than these fight patterns? Because there are some internal things that are really key to be able to stay out of them. One is being willing to own your own junk and stop blaming and stop needing to win so much. A quarrel is quickly settled when deserted by one party. There is no battle unless there be two. There is no battle unless there be two. If one of you is willing to pull out of an argument, there will be no argument. So, considering that, then looking to one of my foundational principles in working with couples is a unilateral commitment, and that is the belief that a unilateral commitment is when we are committed to bringing our best to the relationship, even when our spouse is not. A bilateral commitment is when you're willing to bring your best when the other person is as well. A bilateral commitment is, how almost every business runs. Almost every treaty is a bilateral commitment. But God's commitment to us is a unilateral one. The covenant that He makes to us is to be there for us, no matter what we bring to the table. And so, for us to mirror that in our relationships, in increasing measure as we grow, we should be more and more willing to bring our best self, even when our spouse is not. And this really unlocks a lot of these fight patterns, because if we know I'm not entitled to be kind of crazy just because my spouse is, then it's going to make the arguments be an argument of one, which is not an argument, and things are really going to change. And so that's one encouragement I have, is really growing and owning your own stuff and not needing to win and to pull out of this blame and courtroom dynamic. And in that way, really own the unilateral commitment in marriage. Secondly, we need to tolerate that we see things differently, and that does not make our spouse a criminal. It just makes them different than us. So let me see if I can fill this out a little bit. Let's say one of you thinks it's actually sort of fine to have your phone at the dinner table and to be, kind of responsive to texts that may come in, and that's not, that's just sort of normal. It's kind of normal 20th century life, and you don't have a problem with it. And let's say the other of you thinks that this is wrong, immature, animalistic, juvenile, amoral, and rude and addictive. Okay, so I've discovered in my work with couples that this kind of difference is kind of normal, right? So there are people who think it's not really that bad to have your phone at the table and check it sometimes. And then there are people who feel so strongly that it is horrific to have your phone at the table. So let's say you're coming from the perspective of thinking it's horrific to have your phone at the table, and so you really judge your partner for their point of view. Now, if you do not tolerate this difference between you very well, all of your work and all of your energy is going to be spent on trying to change your partner's mind about whether it's okay to have the phone at the table. Okay, so you'll just go in and it is so rude. It's because of your parents that you feel this way. You're teaching our children all horrible things. I feel neglected. I mean, all the ways, whatever. You're going to bring it on and try to convince your spouse it's wrong for them. Now, if, however, you do the work of understanding, okay, this is a difference. I have a preference, a very strong preference, that we not use phones at the table. And, my partner does not have that preference. It's not a big deal to them. Then, and you tolerate that, and you work it out, in your prayer life and through journaling, and you realize my partner's okay with it. Then you might approach them differently. If you tolerate the difference and you don't criminalize your partner or make it a moral failing that they feel like they do, then you might say, hey, honey, um, I just love having kind of a sacred space without phones during dinner. And I know it's my thing, and it's not yours, but I was wondering, would you be willing to talk with me about maybe sometimes our dinners could be phone-free times, or some other time could we talk about that and what that might look like? So when you're doing that, you're tolerating the difference and you're owning your preference. You might even make a request about your preference, but you're not criminalizing your spouse in the process. The same can go in all kinds of differences. This is just one that I see have people fighting about a lot, and I see the partner that dislikes the phone usually is really in a place of like, you are completely wrong and I need to convince you of that, when really, if they were tolerant of the difference, a fight might not emerge from it, but rather a conversation where there's just a clean request made. Okay, and then now, one of the main things I want to leave you with is the hope that you will hear me on the brain's going offline. No point in continuing this, because that's when you're really going to get locked into a fight pattern, and to take some time before you come back. Now, if you take, I call this take in five. Take five. Take at least five, okay? Take five, but when you take five, have some things in mind. So don't just take five and get madder, and then come back and talk more, or like, make your case better in your mind, but rather ask yourself some key questions. One, am I acting like I'm in a courtroom, or am I acting like I'm in a relationship? If you realize that you've been lawyering up in this conversation, or if you've been on the other end of feeling like you've been lawyered up against, then notice that, name that, like, wow, I really feel like this has been a courtroom. How can I help this feel like a relationship and a conversation about relationship? Two, are you accidentally getting into secondary and tertiary arguments about whether I was yelling, or whether the other person's too sensitive, or whatever it might be? And can you kind of pull back to what was it we were trying to talk about? And can we have a more grounded conversation about that if we come back once our brains are back online? Three, am I blaming, or am I being defensive? And to really take responsibility for that if you are. Remember, it feels good to be the victim. It feels very yummy. We like to be in that place. We don't like to be in the place of responsibility. I mean, a lot, some of us struggle with it anyway. But to step into that, like, okay, I'm going to be responsible. I'm going to own what I need to own. I do not need to blame my partner, and I don't need to be defensive like I have been. And to try to have a different kind of conversation. Finally, are you trying to obliterate difference by arguing your partner out of their point of view, rather than allowing that you're different in this way and just making a request from that space? And so if you're trying to obliterate difference between you, notice that and then say, okay, no, we are different, but can we still be good partners even though we're different? And I would suggest, yes, you can. You can be very good partners even though you're different. You just have to learn how to tolerate the distress of those differences inside. Lastly, and I just really encourage this last one, have you behaved in a manner you regret? And is an apology in order? And if so, please go make that repair attempt. And this is what I suggest you do when you take five. Now, what I'd like you to commit to during this time of frayed nerves and increased tension is to commit to each other. Okay, if we get elevated, let's commit to take five. And during take five, I'm going to ask myself those questions from that video. because maybe you've written them down. That would be helpful if you wrote them down. If you're with me, I would give them to you on a card, but we're not together, so I can't give them to you. But write them down so that you can just look at them and see them and review for yourself, how am I doing, so you can come back to the relationship and to the conversation in a new spirit. Now, if you are the person that needs the take five, I encourage you, one, to take responsibility for coming back and naming when you'll come back to the conversation, and not to wait too long. Nobody needs like 3 days for their prefrontal cortex to come back online. It takes in 5 minutes, sometimes people can get there, but if you do nothing to calm yourself down or soothe yourself, it should take like 20 or 25 minutes and your brain will come back online and you should be able to start anew. Now, if you're on the other side of your spouse requesting a take five, then my encouragement to you is let them go. Even though it's going to be hard for you, let them go get their brain back online. There's nothing that good that's going to come from staying in it when either of you is elevated like that. Okay, friends, these are my tips. I hope it's helpful. I hope that you find that these are ways that you can actually start to name with your partner things that are coming up and find your way out of them differently so that your marriage will not go into the toilet during this time of social isolation, but rather you might even be able to start unhooking some longstanding fight patterns and creating some new dynamics that could last the rest of your marriage. God bless you.